Listen, I've got to tell you, you're one of my favorite guests, and I've said this to a few guests, so, but I do mean it, because I think I came across you and your work, I don't know, it must have been around 2021. I invited you onto my podcast. I can't watch that anymore. It makes me cringe. The way I spoke to you was completely unprofessional. And the reason is because this was a paradigm shift that I wasn't ready for yet.
Well, you're quite welcome. And I also extend my gratitude to you because, you were willing to entertain quite revolutionary ideas about health and medicine. And you brought me onto a platform to help, other people hear the message. And, the facts speak for themselves. So once you can put the emotions aside and actually apply logic and reason to the matter, you'll come around.
Let's start at the start here. So this is your first time on my UK column show. So we're talking effectively about germ theory versus terrain theory, basically why germs don't cause sickness. Why is this important?
Well, I mean, the whole modern healthcare system is based around germs being the cause of a lot of things, right? Obviously, aside from COVID, we already had, HIV and AIDS, bacterial pneumonia and other infections, flesh-eating bacteria, sexually transmitted diseases. Even unexplained illnesses, they suspect, right, that there are viruses involved with certain cancers, even diabetes. So it's pervasive, and there are many, what I would consider false remedies or more bluntly poisons that are used routinely, like antibiotics and antivirals, right, based on a false premise. Yeah, well, there was a vigorous debate around this idea, and the medical community, largely in the 19th century, was very much against this as the nature of reality, and it was really Robert Koch's work and Pasteur's work that pushed it to the forefront, and coincided with the Rockefeller medicine Flexner report as well.
Yeah, you mentioned Robert Koch. Now, I mean, he created those postulates on which
he wrote them down. He didn't actually create them. There's another scientist that talked about that before, but that's how history works, right? Some people get credit, and even if they didn't do the work. But it's basically if any layperson were to think about it and ponder it for a while, how do you prove that a germ causes a disease? It's pretty self-evident. I mean, first of all, you'd have to find the germ in the person who is sick, right? And a corollary to that is you should not find it in someone who's healthy, right? Because if that germ causes the disease, if it's present, there should be the disease. And then you should be able to find that germ in the sick person, right, that you think has the disease that the germ causes, and take it out of the person. And then once you take it out, then you can give it to another organism who's healthy, right? This could be an animal or a human, and then show that they manifest the same disease. So, very simple. I think anyone in the audience, if you just thought about it a little, you would come up with those ideas as a way to test this hypothesis that a germ causes a disease. And they teach this still, to medical students and other health professions. But what they don't do in school is they don't show you the actual experiments for each germ. Because, and there's a specific reason for that, is because those experiments don't actually satisfy the postulates. One, that in the organism with the disease, you find the germ that causes it. Then you can take that germ out. Now, officially it says grow it in a pure culture, but you just have to have it by itself, really. Then you can take that germ, put it in a healthy organism, And it should be, of course, by a natural route of how you think this spreads in nature, and then show that that organism gets the same disease. So like Robert Koch did research on tuberculosis. Okay, now we're told that tuberculosis is caused by a bacteria, right? It's called Mycobacterium tuberculi or something like that. And Robert Koch was trying to apply his own postulates to tuberculosis, and he failed miserably, but was given credit as if he didn't fail for some reason. And so he couldn't actually find the mycobacterium in people with tuberculosis. And he also found it in people without tuberculosis. So right on the first, on its face, it failed.
I used AI and asked it to search the internet for any clinical trial that successfully shows transmission of a pathogen between humans. And it comes up with the results saying it cannot find anything like that.
Well, so I don't trust AI, so I wouldn't rely only on those results. But in this case, that matches with my own research. And I'm sure you've had or are planning to have Daniel Roydus as a guest, who wrote the book.
I have spoken to him.
Can You Catch a Cold, where he reviewed, over 100 studies trying to show that colds are contagious. They even, had a facility in the UK. I forget what it's called, but it was advertised like, come here, volunteer to be an experimental subject and have like a vacation. Like it was on a very pastoral piece of land and such. And they put people in cabins together, where somebody had a cold and there were 2 or 3 people that spent a couple of days in the cabin with them to see if they got colds as well. Those kinds of experiments. And they were never able to really prove or gather any sufficient evidence about contagion of colds and flu whatsoever.
Oh, but the counter response, Andy, is that, well, their immune systems were strong. They were healthy.
Well, I mean, you could say that, but then you would have to do experiments to show that that was the case, right? Now, these were largely, all these studies were done with healthy people, healthy volunteers who, didn't have immunosuppressive drugs, didn't have immune deficiency syndromes or anything like that. So, what happens here is that there's a false reasoning in what you just said, because the way science works is you come up with a hypothesis, right? That, that colds are contagious. They pass from one person to another through bodily secretions, right? And that's what we're told happens today. So then you design an experiment, right, where you expose healthy people to the secretions of the sick people, and you see if they get the same illness. Now, the hypothesis would say that all the people exposed would get the illness, but then you do the experiment and that's not what happens. So what you should do then is revise your hypothesis and then design a new experiment to test that. But that's not what happened. What happened is that they don't get the results that would support their hypothesis. So after the fact, they just change their hypothesis so the results support it, but only with a mild modification, right? So they say, well, this proves that it's contagious and the people who didn't get sick, they had a faulty immune system. But we didn't measure their immune system. There's no way to measure it. We don't actually have an experiment where we test that, but it helps us keep our hypothesis going. A true scientist, who would look at those results empirically would say, what if there's some other reason these folks are sick? And let's test that, and that's what wasn't done, unfortunately. No matter what the results are, they still kept their hypothesis exactly the same and just tried to explain it away with that sort of post hoc analysis.
I mean, a common response, Andy, is that they say, well, we have other ways of testing these things. We don't need to use a double-blind trial.
Modeling is definitely something I talk a lot about. And I think there's modeling in terms of in vitro experiments where you take things out of the organism and mess around with them in the laboratory in unnatural or artificial conditions. And then there's also computer simulations like we see with, for example, the metagenomic sequencing, right, which is how they come up with essentially manufactured genome sequences for viruses. And when I was an undergraduate, I had a summer job initially at a biotech company, and it became like a part-time job throughout the year. And I was introduced to what they call molecular modeling. And this is where you use a pretty sophisticated computer workstation. And it has this very powerful software where you can input the X-ray crystal structure of like an enzyme, like a protein. And that would be a target for a drug, for example, or something that you just wanted to study biologically. And you can do all of these simulations or modeling of different interactions with other molecules. So you can sort of, for example, have a candidate drug molecule, and you can upload that molecule and the target. Like when I was there, they were working on thrombin inhibitors. Thrombin is a enzyme in the clotting system. So they were trying to develop a blood thinning drug. They actually have one on the market now. So they were, successful. And so I would input different versions of the candidate drug molecules and model the interactions with the thrombin protein. And when we applied this to experimental research in the laboratory, we saw that it did not predict the results. And also, they sent me on a training course for a few days to learn how to use this software because it was not easy to use. In fact, no one in the company knew how to use it. They were only using it to make pictures. They weren't actually using it for its intended purpose. So when I went on that course, I learned that there were like dozens of number values that you had to just set because these were things that couldn't be measured. They couldn't be known or they were unknown, and you would basically set them where you thought they should be. And when I started tweaking around with those settings, those inputs, it vastly changed the results. And this is the problem, is that a computer model, a statistical model, a in vitro laboratory model, all these things can be highly manipulated, and even kind of subconsciously, because, as the scientist, you expect certain results, you believe that your hypotheses are correct, and that's a bias. And so if you're using a model, you're going to tweak that model to support your bias, and it's not measuring reality. Like if we look at the climate change models that are published in the IPCC reports and such, if you look back at what they predicted based on those models in the past and then look at what the actual weather patterns were, you'll see they didn't predict anything accurately whatsoever.
But now we have global cooling, Andy.
It's before that environmental conference in Brazil where they first talked about global warming, before that there was even I think a documentary on public television in the U.S. that was narrated by Leonard Nimoy, talking about that the Earth is headed for another ice age.
Spock.
Dr. Spock, exactly.
Yeah.
So saying that we were headed for another ice age. So, and then all of a sudden it flipped after this conference in Brazil. And then, it's changed since then because it was global warming and now it's climate change, right? Because, the Earth wasn't getting warmer, so they couldn't say that anymore. They had to say something different.
We have bacteria that we can see under a microscope and we can play with it and it's living and all that sort of thing. A virus is an entirely different concept, and the definition has changed over the years anyway.
Well, the original term virus really referred to like poison, like things like snake venom and such. So it definitely, if you start reading dictionaries from the past, you'll see that the meaning of many words have changed, right? We saw that happen in real time during COVID, right, where they changed the definition of vaccine to include, RNA and DNA based technologies. So the modern definition of virus, I think, we should take it from modern biology, and which essentially defines it as a obligate intracellular parasite, right? Meaning that it has to invade to a cell in order to reproduce, and that it's can replicate under those conditions, and of course cause then damage to the host organism as a result.
But that's never been observed.
No, absolutely not. And how it couldn't really be observed with current technology. I mean, unless you rebuilt Rife's microscope. If you look at the research, I mean, like you said, with bacteria, if you pretty much swab anything around you, including yourself, right, and then look under a microscope, a regular light microscope, where you can look at living cells, you'll see bacterial cells, right, of probably a variety of different kinds. So we know they're there. We know they can be, separated out or, from things, right? No problem. With viruses, they're said to be so small, right, around the size of 100 nanometers, right? And a nanometer is a billionth or 10 to the minus ninth meters. So they can't be observed in a light microscope. Particles that size can be seen only on an electron microscope, and you have to, destroy whatever you're looking at to see it under an electron microscope, essentially. So you can't observe the behavior of things on that scale. But if you look at the experiments which are done to discover a virus, in nature, right? And these are always related to, they think it causes a disease. They never actually find the virus. They don't even really look for it. They just assume it's there from the beginning. So they have a sick animal or a sick human, they take some body tissue or fluid, they assume there's a virus in there, but they don't actually find the virus in there. And they don't even look. Like, they don't take that and look under the microscope. They don't take that and separate out everything but a virus. They just have the assumption there's a virus in there, and then they do experiments. And the results that they get just basically form circular reasoning, because we assume there's a virus. We assume a virus will result in what they call CPEs in a cell culture. It's like a damp inflammation in a cell culture, essentially. And then they say CPEs mean there's a virus. So that makes a complete circle in their logic. But they never show there's a virus at any stage of the experiment. They never make any attempt to separate out the virus in order to test it independently. They had tried that in the past and were unsuccessful, but they have the ability to do that with other particles that are the same size scale. So, for example, there's a paper that it's part of one of my presentations, and it just illustrates this point so well, because what the paper is it's a study about HIV exosomes. So this is, exosomes are basically also particles that are about the same size as viruses, but they say that these are generated by our own cells. Okay, that they have some biological function, and there's a whole field of research looking at exosomes. Now, so they say that when you have a disease, your body makes exosomes, a certain type of exosome, in response to the disease. So they're looking at people who, have an antibody test for HIV, And so they say they're, essentially like AIDS patients or HIV patients. And so they want to look at their exosomes. And all they do is take a sample of their blood, and then they, excuse me, use some physical methods to separate out the exosomes. And then they're able to have the exosomes in a separate container. They look at them under the microscope, and you only see particles that are identical. You don't see anything else in there because they've separated it. And then they can do experiments on it, and they do in this. They do an enzyme assay for acetylcholinesterase. They do a protein electrophoresis to characterize the proteins in the particles, right? And they can even sequence the genome because they can get genetic material directly from those particles. Now, in the same experiment, that patient also allegedly has HIV viral particles. Why didn't they also separate those and run tests on them? They didn't. They didn't even attempt it, right? And it's because they know they wouldn't be able to find it. So that's the big thing, that they can do the actual proper experiments to find viruses and study them, but they don't do it because somewhere back in time, they figured out that there are no viruses. But it was very profitable, and there were maybe other motivations to keep it going, maybe to sell vaccines, because that has become now the most lucrative type of pharmaceutical since COVID. But nonetheless, no modern virologists, no modern doctors ever look back at those experiments to see. They never look at the current experiments to see, right? They're just told in their education that this virus causes this disease.
Let's say you are out in the wild and you see a carcass and it's surrounded by hyenas. The hyenas are cleaning it up. Now, can you assume that the hyenas killed that animal? No, most likely not. They came after the fact. And that sort of is the way I've kind of observed or thought about viral load, right?
Well, I mean, if viral load actually measured, viruses, then yes, you could think that about it. So that analogy, I think, is more appropriate for bacteria, because bacteria are really there. And you will, in many disease states, find a lot of bacteria in the diseased tissue, right? And it's because it is coming there after to scavenge and clean it up, just like the hyenas in your example. But viral load, despite its name, actually doesn't measure viruses at all. It doesn't really measure anything, actually. It's a manufacturing technique. So that's the PCR process. It shouldn't be called a test, because that's not what it is. What it does is whatever is in your sample, it reproduces it. So it's like a manufacturing facility that has like a replicator, right? Like kind of Star Trek technology. You put in something and then it makes copies of it. But what is the thing it's making copies of? Like, that's the question, because it's only a short strand, right, of genetic material, a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of the whole of an organism's genetic material. And these small short sequences are non-specific. Like if you, and they're called primers, by the way. That's in the PCR process, it's called the primer, the thing that you're making copies of. Or you're finding if it's there, you're going to make copies of it. And if you take the sequence of a primer, like look at a particular PCR protocol and find the primer sequence, and then take that sequence and put it in a genetic database to see if it matches any known organisms, you'll find that a bunch of organisms come up for all these sequences. So that those short strands are not specific, right? And for any one organism at all. And that is obviously a problem, because if any of the other organisms are there, well, then you have a false, your result tells you something different than you think it tells you, because it doesn't tell you anything about a possible virus. It tells you, oh, there's genetic material that may be from a variety of organisms present in your sample. And the other problem with PCR is that it works by doubling, right? So it has like manufacturing rounds or cycles that, so first, if there is a matching little piece of genetic material in the sample, it'll double it. So if let's say there's 10 copies of it to begin with, after the first round, there'll be 20. And then after the second round, 40. Right, and each time it'll double, and so that's like an exponential rise. And each time you do this, it can make mistakes. So in other words, when it makes a copy, it might make a copy with something's different on it. Pretty much like they say mutations work. And if you do enough cycles of doubling, the number of mistakes goes up. And you could end up at some point where whatever it's making at the end wasn't present in the starting material at all. It's completely manufactured through errors of the copying process. And just like that if you if you had an old-fashioned photocopier, like now we have these in our office computers, and made a copy of something, then took the copy, made a copy of the copy, made another copy of that copy, a copy of that copy, you'd see the quality degrade, right? And the same thing happens with PCR, and really PCR is kind of like a molecular photocopier.
Okay, but Andy, I mean, this is just all academic. How does this affect me, in my day-to-day life?
Well, those viral load PCR procedures are used diagnostically to, tell you that you have a virus in your body, or sometimes even they use it for bacteria too, and it has problems there as well. So, like I had a client, because I do educational consultations around natural healing and such, and I had someone a couple of years ago who came to me, and in the 80s, during the AIDS scare, right? He was in the homosexual community. He got tested and was told he was HIV positive. And now he wasn't sick at all. He just, because of his lifestyle, he went and got this test. Now, the people who gave him the results, they told him that he should just go and apply for disability, like Social Security disability through the government, because he was going to get sick and die and not be able to take care of himself anyway. And just from having this, lab test, which it wasn't a PCR then, it was an antibody test, but the same thing would happen if it was a viral load test, and went on disability. And now he got in touch with me like 30 years or 25 years later, never got sick, right? And now he's kind of questioning what he should do. He was even been taking like prophylactic medications all this time. And, so he basically, all of his productive adult life was lost because he just became dependent and expecting to get sick and die at any time. Right? So that's a extremely serious consequence of believing this false information.
It's sad to me, though, that so many people have bought into this, and it almost seems like it's not going to change.
Well, I don't, I'm more optimistic than you about this, Germ. Like, I feel like already there's been a lot of traction. I mean, this is part of the discussion. Even mainstream people have heard about this. Now, they may think it's ridiculous, right? But just it being spoken is, a major accomplishment. If we look at, paradigm shifts throughout history, they take time, right? And people have written about this, how, when you introduce a new idea, even if it's true, first you're ridiculed, right? Then there's conversation about it, but skepticism, and eventually it just becomes the new paradigm. So we need more time, and definitely, I'm glad that I can come on here again and talk about this topic, because it needs to be repeated over and over so that it can start to settle into people's thinking, because it's so heretical when you first hear about that, germs don't cause disease, viruses don't even exist. It's so far astray from the mainstream and what you've been told your whole life. And you even have experience that, with confirmation bias seems to give weight to that. It's only when you look at it more objectively that you see that could be interpreted a number of ways. So that's why it takes, time and time again to introduce the idea so that you can say, maybe I should look into this. Because the evidence is quite compelling. And, doctors and virologists, if you go to your doctor and ask them, say, how do we know that this virus causes this disease? They won't have the first clue. They might give an answer, right? But they won't be able to tell you, what the experiment was. Oh, can you describe the experiment to me? Can you tell me the name of the scientist who discovered it, right? They'll know nothing about that. And that should be a good indication of, like, interesting. Why don't they know that? Like, if it's so well established, it should be like a matter of pride to learn about the experiments that discovered it. I mean, think about it, how heroic that could be. And that should be a clue that I wonder what those studies actually show. Why don't I take a look at them or read about someone who described it in a way you can understand?
Mike Eden's got a great Substack in which he lists clinical trials over the last 200 years attempting to show transmission of any pathogen between humans, and every single one is a failure. And it goes, they also mentioned the Spanish flu one. That was a famous one. I forget now who was the scientist behind that one. You know the one I'm talking about?
Yes, of course. And there was a series of experiments, and
they had 100 healthy soldiers, and they couldn't make one of them sick. I forget his name now. Anyway, but what's interesting is when we're talking about viruses, right? Like earlier, you say
Rosenau.
Yeah, that's right, Rosenau. There we go. You'll see a picture. Somebody will give you a picture, this little black and white image, right? And it's a circle with little things sticking out of it, and I'll go, there it is. That's the virus. And I've asked this question so many times. How do you know?
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. And this goes back to what I was saying before about exosomes, because, in that experiment, after they used physical means to separate out the exosomes from everything else in the blood, they took some of that and looked at it under the electron microscope. And the only thing you see are identical round particles, right, of the same size and morphology. So that what's in that, you have a pure sample of these particles. And you confirm that, right? So now in the future, if you're looking for these particles in other people, you at least have some basis of identifying them. Although certainly different things can look the same, right? So you have to be careful of that. But with respect to the images that they show of viruses, that's never been done. They've never, separated it out and then showed a picture of just that and then taken that and done experiments like with Koch's postulates to show that it produces the same image. What they do instead is they have the assumption, right? They would, if they use blood, like let's say they were going to use blood like it with the exosomes, they would take the blood, right? That has many, many things in it. It has particles in it. It has cells in it. It has proteins in it, right? And various other molecules like clotting factors and things like that that are circulating around the blood, maybe cholesterol, right? All of that's in the blood. They take the whole blood. Maybe they filter out the really big things like the blood cells and just have the fluid. But it's got a whole bunch of things. Now they assume a virus is in there, but never show it. Now then they take that whole thing and put it under an electron microscope, and they see everything that's in there. They see cells, they see particles, right? They see cellular organelles, all these things. But they don't know what any of these things are. At least the particles, there's no way to identify them. There's no specific label or stain that's used that only, lights up those things. They could make things like that, but they don't. They just have an expert microscopist look at everything under the microscope, and then whatever they think the virus is supposed to look like, they just point to that and say that that's the virus. But there's no proof what that is. It could be a million things. It could be an exosome. It could be another type of vesicle that are all known that could be seen in healthy samples as well. So it's completely arbitrary.
But with bacteria, you can actually test these things. And even then, disease hasn't been shown to be caused by them.
Yeah, that's right. With you can take, so if there's, let's say, bacteria in the blood, okay, so you take that blood sample, you can put that under a light microscope, which doesn't require any processing of the blood. Like you could just take the raw living blood right there and plop it on a microscope slide and look at it under a high power objective, and you can see if there's bacteria in there. Then you can do simple processes to physically separate out those bacteria, and then you can grow them on in a petri dish to make more of them if you want to, or you could just take the ones you found directly there and do experiments on them, like put them in a healthy organism, see if they make the organism sick.
Okay, but let's look at some real examples. We take some water from a pond that's got stuff floating on it. It looks like bacteria, and you drink that and you get a bit sick.
Well, you didn't just drink the pure bacteria. You drank everything that was in that water. So how do you know what was in there? That's exactly the experiment that they do with viruses, right? Except that you can actually show there's bacteria in that pond water, right? Instead of just assuming it. But yeah, you can't. If you have a whole mixture of things, you can't tell what thing in that mix is producing the effect. So this is what's known as an independent variable. You can't do a scientific experiment, according to the scientific method, unless you have an independent variable. That's the one thing you're testing. So you would have to take that pond water and separate out the bacteria from everything else, right? Because there could be agricultural runoff with chemicals in there. There could be overgrowth of a certain organism and a bunch of fecal material. Like who knows what's in there that could potentially be harmful to health.
The one that always comes up. My kid went to school and 13 of the 20 kids got chickenpox.
Well, those aren't real numbers. You're just making those numbers up. But, this is what I was talking about earlier, that you might have some life experience that you would interpret as supporting, contagion, but you don't actually have the evidence. So let's say you do that Well, did you observe any viruses going from the first kid with chickenpox to the other kids? Right, because that's what we're told contagion does. That's not something you can observe, right? So you don't have direct proof. So what you observe is that there's one child who's sick, and then there are other children who become sick with the similar issues, right, in a close time proximity and a close geographic location. So are there any other commonalities? You said that the kid went to school. So what are they exposed to at the school? Is there something there that they were all exposed to that could have resulted in this? What about the season, right? They're all experiencing the same environmental stimuli. So could that be involved? What about their stage of development? Are they all at the same, stage of development? Could that be involved? And none of those other possibilities have ever been looked at seriously, because they're like all the other, viral illnesses. There's just been the assumption that this is caused by a virus. But when they do experiments like where they take fluid out of the chickenpox lesion and inject that into a healthy subject, the healthy subject doesn't get chickenpox. Right. And that would be, the more speaking to the direct proof that this contagion occurs. I attended a family reunion several years ago, and we all ate at the same restaurant. And that night, maybe 30% of the people who were there all were throwing up and having diarrhea and, pretty miserable. And did we pass, viruses around causing that, right? Rotavirus, what they say causes that? No, we ate the same dish at the restaurant, and it was food poisoning. So we don't need any virus to explain that, but it's the same experience, that you discussed, that people would interpret as evidence of contagion.
It's entirely possible that we have a very impoverished view on what causes these things. Why do we yawn collectively?
Yeah, or when women's become close in their relationship, that their periods synchronize, right? Their menstrual cycles. No one suspects there's a menstrual cycle virus.
Yeah, and I chatted to somebody who argues for something called German new medicine. Very, very interesting topic. And she was saying that the kids who get chickenpox most likely have something called separation anxiety, which is a stress-induced response because they are away from their families and in environments that are a little bit alien.
I would say that what you can take away from that is that a psychological insult, like a trauma, for example, or a bereavement, right? Grief can definitely manifest physically in a variety of ways. And that's something that is definitely underrepresented in the medical system.
I mean, stress causes sickness. There's no doubt about that. It's not even debatable.
No, of course not. I mean, I think, there are quite extreme examples of that, right? Like I'm pretty sure that there are people who developed cancer exclusively because of a psychological damage.
But then what is the takeaway? Someone listening to this going, okay, sure. All right. So viruses don't exist or germs don't cause disease, but we all still get sick. So now what?
Well, I think it's pretty obvious that when it comes to understanding your health, you want to know as much truth as possible because that allows you to make decisions to improve your health. Right? So, yes, we all get sick from time to time, but not to the same degree. Right? There are some people who get, bronchitis, pneumonia, and are sick, repeatedly throughout the cold season. And then there are some people who get a mild cold every 3 years, right? And what's the difference between those people? What's really causing health problems? Like in the even outside of germ theory, right? We have this huge increase in chronic disease over the last century, and pretty much the medical system says we don't have any idea what's causing it, right? Like autoimmune diseases, for example. Even cancer, they don't even claim to know what's causing cancer, right? Even though they talk about specific genetic mutations, most cancers the people don't have those. So we're really being kept from important knowledge and from making really solid determinations about what specifically. Now in my research, in order to understand what is causing these health problems, I have to rely on indirect and anecdotal evidence, because the mainstream authorities or the people who fund the research or who are doing this research are not looking for the real truth. They are basically just continuing to perpetuate the same kind of profitable frauds. So, the more people start to realize the truth, then the society is going to put more resources into finding the truth. But I can tell you, even with what I have been able to learn and observe from many other people who have come to similar conclusions, is that people can fully turn around their health from these chronic conditions, like completely reverse them, not by taking pharmaceutical drugs and getting surgical procedures, but by lifestyle changes, using nature, things like fasting, sweating, enemas. These are what can, help people's bodies heal.
And also changing your diet.
Absolutely. That's when I talk about lifestyle changes, it's
right.
Diet is the biggest thing by far.
I remember during the COVID era, I visited a friend, and he was still caught up in this whole thing, and he was sick at the time. And I went up to him, and he threw out his elbow, to greet me, and I just smiled, and I just walked up to him and gave him a hug. And the point that I'm making is that I don't think I can pick up anything from anybody. So that's precisely what happened. I didn't pick up anything from him.
Yes, well,
it's the aspect of fear. It's the fear. That's what I'm talking about.
No, that's an excellent point. I should have, been thinking along those lines. But since the tyranny of the COVID era has passed, that's not in my consciousness. But you're absolutely right. The germ theory makes you afraid of your brother, right? Because they're going to get you sick, and that separates us, makes us lonely, increases things like addiction. So it's a very, very deleterious.
You don't see this in the animal kingdom. So here in South Africa, we've got the Kruger National Park, which is a huge game park. It's the size of Israel, so it's pretty big. And in the last 120 years of its existence, there has never been an epidemic of any kind, other than the fact that where there have been a few collective illnesses with the animals, it's generally related to something like pollution that came down one of the rivers, and normally it's some third party interference that created that.
Yeah, I completely agree. When you do see these types of events, there's always a rational explanation. Usually some kind of pollution that is very poisonous. And I think that that happens with some of these human outbreaks as well. And the virus story is a way to cover it up. Like I would bet that any of these, hemorrhagic fever outbreaks like Ebola and Marburg, I would bet that those are due to some kind of toxic exposure. and that the story of this really, really scary virus is just to cover it up. And, because think about it, like, if there was a virus that had like an 80% mortality, and the way it killed you is you essentially bleed and drown on your own blood, that's so scary that, you don't question it. You just hope that it doesn't affect you, and you hope they figure out a way to make a vaccine.
But I mean, some of it is also so just ridiculous. If you think about HIV, which you mentioned earlier, it suddenly appeared in the 1980s, and it didn't like gay men in nightclubs in New York. Let's be quite specific here. And then somehow it ended up in Africa, and it took a decade or two for them to decide what the definition of AIDS actually is. So you had a virus,
and it's different in different countries.
Yes.
In Africa, they needed something to blame all of the mining related illness, so that the mining companies wouldn't have to pay disability. And, so that's why like tuberculosis and other pulmonary conditions are emphasized in Africa compared to the US.
So how can my audience follow your work?
Well, I'm at Dr. Andrew Kaufman on all the social platforms, Instagram, YouTube, etc. And also andrewkaufmanmd.com is the website where you can get access to my free protocol and many free workshops and resources there. So definitely check that out if you want to learn more about natural health.
I want to add a disclaimer because this always comes up. Oh, okay. So is he a virologist? And thank goodness you are not, because if you were a virologist, you would be stuck within those parameters. And that's a problem, I think, with hyperspecialization, is that you get forced into a lane and you cannot get out of that lane. So you have to argue as a virologist that viruses are real.
Well, yeah, I mean, if I was a virologist, I would be now a former virologist. But you're right, because once you realize the truth, it's like, what are you doing? You have to get out of there. But, even though I never did virology research, I've been in the lab. I've done all kinds of molecular stuff, ran electrophoresis, southern blots, northern blots, PCRs, all those kind of same techniques that are used, in virology. I'm very familiar with how they work. So, that's how I'm able to understand that research so thoroughly. But it's important, that's a logic fallacy, of course. It's called appeal to authority when, you say only someone with a certain credential or status, is capable of understanding something. And that's a trap, right? That's a big reason why we're all so ignorant about so many things, is because we think, oh, I couldn't possibly understand about electricity, so I'll have to, rely on an engineer or a physicist, or I couldn't possibly understand about nuclear energy or medicine or, chemicals or whatever. And, but the truth is, we can all understand these things. So we just have to, spend a little time and effort. Because I think the biggest barrier is just the language, that all the, it's natural for people when they get expert in a certain field to develop your own terms, because you've got unique, concepts that you're talking about, or unique tools that you use in your trade or whatever. So even, craftsmen who are specialized, like a glass blower, has special terminology, and, you wouldn't know what they're talking about unless you take the time to learn that. So that's the big barrier. But it's important that we make the effort to understand these things, no matter what, even if we didn't graduate high school, that doesn't mean you can't understand how an experiment works or how the scientific method works. And I'm a huge proponent of becoming an autodidact. And that once you are able to achieve that, then there's no barriers to what you can learn about and understand.
Knowledge is open source.
That's right.
Andrew Kaufman, thank you for joining me in the trenches.
Great to be here, Jerm.